Think about what it feels like to put your hands in soil, not potting mix from a bag, real soil. Dark, living earth that has been building its character for thousands of years. The way it holds moisture but is not wet. The way it crumbles but has weight. The way it smells. That deep, specific ancient smell that scientists have discovered comes from a chemical produced by soil bacteria, a smell so fundamental to human experience that we have evolved a specific neurological response to it. It calms us, it makes us feel on some level that is older than language that we are home. For 10,000 years, every farmer who ever lived had that contact, kneeling in it, turning it, pressing seeds into it, reading it with their hands to know whether it was ready, whether it was tired, whether it needed something it was not getting. The soil was not just the medium they worked in, it was the primary source of information about how the farming was going. You knew your land because you touched it every day, and then something changed. This episode is the story of how that gap opened, how machines and chemistry transformed farming beyond anything previous generations could have imagined, feeding more people than ever before, producing abundance at a scale that genuinely seemed miraculous, and how in doing all of that, they quietly severed the oldest and most important connection in human history. The connection between a person and the specific piece of earth they tend. Before we go forward into the Industrial Revolution and the chemistry that followed it, I want to pause on something that tends to get skipped over in the history of agriculture, because it matters enormously for understanding what was later lost in the medieval period, roughly from the fall of the Roman Empire to the beginning of industrialization. Farming across much of Europe and Asia operated at a human scale. Not a romantic scale, not a comfortable scale by any modern standard. Medieval farming was hard physical work with very little margin for error, but it was a scale at which something important was still functioning. The farmer knew their land. Personally, intimately, the way you know a person you have lived alongside for years. They knew which corner of the field drained slowly after rain, which patch of soil produced the sweetest grain, where the frost came first and where it lingered longest. This knowledge was not written down anywhere. It lived in the body, in the hands and eyes and feet of people who walked the same ground every day through every season of every year of their working lives. And from that closeness, medieval farmers arrived at something that the great empires before them had lost: rotation. The understanding that land needs variety and rest. The three-field system, one field growing winter grain, one growing spring crops, one left fallow to recover, became standard across medieval Europe, not because someone read it in a book, but because farmers observed generation after generation that it worked. That rested land produced more, that variety protected the community when one crop struggled, that legumes left the soil better than they found it. This is not a simple idea. It requires a relationship with the land that extends across multiple seasons and multiple years. You have to be willing to leave a third of your farmable land producing nothing this year, trusting that it will produce more next year because of that rest. That is a genuinely sophisticated piece of ecological thinking, and it emerged not from science but from attention, from closeness, from the kind of knowledge that only comes from never being separated from the thing you're trying to understand. The medieval farmer was, in a very real sense, still in conversation with the earth, still listening, still adjusting based on what the land was saying. The Industrial Revolution arrived in the cities first. Steam engines in factories, coal powering production at a scale that handcraft could never match. And for a while, farming watched from a distance, still largely human-powered, still recognizable in its basic character to anyone from the previous 5,000 years. Then the machines came to the field. In 1701, an English farmer named Jethro Tull built a mechanical seed drill, a device that placed seeds at precise, controlled depths in organized rows rather than scattering them broadcast across the surface. It sounds like a small thing. It was not broadcast sowing. Throwing seeds across prepared ground and hoping they found a good spot wasted enormous quantities of seed and produced uneven, struggling crops. The seed drill placed every seed exactly where it needed to be. Germination rates tripled. Then came the mechanical reaper in the 1830s, a horse-drawn machine that could cut grain as fast as 20 people working with scythes. Then the steam-powered thresher that separated grain from stalk without the days of manual work that had previously been required. Then in the early 20th century, the petrol tractor, an engine powerful enough to pull a multi-blade plow through heavy soil at a pace that transformed what a single farmer could manage in a single day. Each of these inventions fed more people, That is simply true and deserves to be said plainly. The seed drill produced more food from the same amount of seed. The reaper allowed harvest to be completed faster and with less loss. The tractor opened up land that no animal-drawn plow could have managed. Real people who would otherwise have gone hungry were fed because of these machines. That matters. It matters enormously. But here's what I want you to notice alongside that achievement. With every machine that entered the field, something changed about the farmer's relationship to the soil. Not suddenly, not dramatically in any single moment, but consistently in one direction over 2 centuries. The farmer moved upward, off their knees and onto their feet, off their feet and onto a horse-drawn implement, off the horse and into a tractor cab. Each move increased the distance, physical, sensory, bodily, between the person farming and the earth being farmed. The information that had once arrived through fingertips and footsteps and the smell of turned soil was now arriving through yield numbers and fuel consumption figures and the view from a cab window several feet above the ground. You cannot feel whether soil is tired from inside a tractor cab. You cannot read whether it needs something from the height of a combine harvester. The knowledge that lived in physical contact with the earth, the 10,000 years of accumulated sensory understanding that had been the foundation of agricultural decision-making, had no place in the new system. It could not be mechanized, and so gradually it began to be replaced. In 1909 in a laboratory in Germany. A chemist named Fritz Haber did something that every agricultural society in the history of the world had been unable to do. He pulled nitrogen out of the air. That sounds almost too simple to be significant. The atmosphere is roughly 78% nitrogen. It is literally all around us, all the time. The problem was that atmospheric nitrogen is chemically inert. Plants cannot use it in that form. For a plant to take nitrogen from its environment and use it to grow, that nitrogen has to first be converted into a form the plant can absorb: ammonia or nitrates. In nature, this conversion is done by specific soil bacteria, by lightning strikes, and by the decomposition of organic matter. It is a slow, limited, precious process, and for 10,000 years it was the ultimate constraint on how much food the earth could produce. You could farm more land, you could breed better crop varieties, you could develop better tools and better irrigation, but ultimately the amount of food you could grow was limited by the amount of nitrogen your soil could produce naturally, which is why rotation mattered, which is why legumes mattered, which is why fallow periods mattered. Every traditional agricultural practice that involved leaving land alone, or growing certain plants, or adding manure, all of it was, at its core, a way of managing the nitrogen supply in the soil. Haber cracked that constraint open. Working with an industrial chemist named Haber-Bosch, he developed a process for synthesizing ammonia from atmospheric nitrogen at industrial scale. Synthetic and nitrogen fertilizer, made in a factory, available in whatever quantities industry could produce. No rotation required, no fallow period, no livestock providing manure, no legumes fixing nitrogen into the soil. Just open a bag, apply it to the field, and the crops will grow. The scale of what happened next is almost impossible to overstate. Global crop yields, which had been rising slowly and unevenly for centuries, began to climb at a pace the world had never seen. The global population, which had taken all of human history to reach 1.5 billion people by 1900, doubled by 1960, doubled again by 1999, and kept climbing. Today it stands at 8 billion. The scientific consensus is that without the Haber-Bosch process, without synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, the earth could not grow enough food to sustain more than roughly half that number. 4 billion people alive today owe their existence in a very direct and measurable sense to Fritz Haber's laboratory breakthrough in 1909. That is one of the most extraordinary facts in the entire history of agriculture, possibly in the entire history of our species, and it came with a cost that nobody fully understood at the time. Because synthetic nitrogen does not just feed crops, it changes the entire ecology of the soil. It floods the system with a nutrient that natural processes had kept carefully balanced for millions of years. It makes certain plants grow explosively, which sounds good until you realize that it makes weeds grow explosively too, requiring herbicides. It runs off into rivers and waterways, producing algal blooms that suffocate aquatic life. It suppresses the soil bacteria whose job it is to produce nitrogen naturally, meaning that soils treated with synthetic nitrogen over long periods gradually lose the biological capacity to sustain themselves without it. The dependency, once established, deepens every season. When mechanization and synthetic inputs came together in the 20th century, they produced something genuinely unprecedented in the history of farming. A single farmer operating a modern combine harvester can harvest in one day what would have taken an entire medieval village several weeks. A single application of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer fertilizer can replace what a carefully managed three-field rotation produced across 3 years. Pesticides eliminated crop losses that had caused famines throughout recorded history. Herbicides removed the labor of weeding that had consumed enormous quantities of human time on every farm in every culture since farming began. The productivity numbers that emerge from this combination are staggering. Wheat yields per acre in England, to take one example, roughly tripled between 1950 and 1990. Similar increases happened across most major crops in most major farming regions of the world. The food that this system produced and continues to produce is what has allowed 8 billion people to exist on a planet. These are real achievements. They deserve genuine acknowledgement. The people who built and refined the system were solving real and urgent problems: hunger, famine, the threat of catastrophic food shortages as the global population grew faster than any previous generation had experienced. They were not making reckless decisions. They were making rational ones based on the information and the priorities available to them at the time. But alongside all of that productivity, something else was happening that the yield numbers did not capture. The knowledge was disappearing. The accumulated, embodied, sensory understanding of soil and season and crop, an ecosystem that had been built up across 10,000 years of close agricultural practice. That knowledge requires proximity to survive. It requires farmers who spend their lives in contact with specific pieces of ground, learning their character across decades of direct observation. As farms grew larger and more mechanized, as the number of people farming declined and the area each one managed expanded, as the decisions shifted from felt observation to chemical application schedules, that knowledge stopped being passed on, not deliberately, not as a policy choice, just gradually, quietly, as the system changed around it and left no space for it to function. Here's the honest summary of what this episode has been about. In roughly 200 years, from Jethro Tull's seed drill to the combine harvester, to the Haber-Bosch process, to the industrialized farming system of the 20th century, agriculture underwent a transformation more rapid and more total than anything in the previous 10,000 years of its history. It became immensely more productive. It fed billions of people who would otherwise not have survived. It solved problems of hunger and famine that had haunted human civilization since the very beginning. These are not small things. They are among the greatest achievements in the history of our species, and they deserve to be recognized as such without qualification. And at the same time, across that same 200 years, something else happened. The farmer's hands left the soil. The knowledge that lived in those hands, in that daily, seasonal, generational contact with a specific piece of living earth, began to lose its home. The conversation between humans and the earth, which had been the foundation of everything since those first deliberate seeds were pressed into soil, was gradually replaced by a transaction. Input and output, application and yield, chemistry and machinery standing in for the ecological intelligence that healthy soil and attentive farming had once provided naturally. We are living with the consequences of both of these things simultaneously: the abundance and the depletion, the productivity and the fragility, the system that feeds 8 billion people and the system that is quietly undermining its own foundations. The question that the next episode will confront directly is this: the green revolution of the mid-20th century took everything we have talked about in this episode and applied it at a scale and intensity that the world had never seen. It saved hundreds of millions of people from famine. It is one of the most significant humanitarian achievements in recorded history, and it concentrated the vulnerabilities of industrial farming, the soil depletion, the biodiversity loss, the chemical dependency, the ecological fragility into a global food system that now feeds most of humanity. How do you hold both of those things honestly at the same time? How do you acknowledge what was saved without looking away from what was lost? And most importantly, now that we understand both sides of that equation clearly, what do we actually do next? That is where we are going, and the answer, when we get there, is more interesting and more hopeful than you might expect, because the knowledge that left the field 200 years ago was never actually destroyed. It went somewhere. It survived in the margins, in traditional farming communities, in indigenous agricultural practice, in the patient work of ecologists and soil scientists who never stopped paying attention to what the living earth was trying to say. The conversation was interrupted. It was not ended. And picking it back up on the scale that now matters is exactly what the most important agricultural work of our time is trying to do.